There are lies that arrive fully formed, with edges and weight, and the specific gravity of something that has been constructed with care. And then there are lies that grow, slowly, organically, one small untruth supporting the next until the whole structure is so large and so load-bearing that the people inside it have forgotten it was ever built at all. My wife's lie was the second kind. And the cruelest part, the part one still turn over in the quiet hours when the apartment is dark and Emma is asleep in the next room, is that it wasn't just her lie. It was her mother's lie too. A woman I had called family for 9 years. A woman who had sat at my table and held my daughter and told me, more than once, that I was the best thing that had ever happened to her child. She knew. She had known for months. And every time I called to check that Claire had arrived safely, every time I said, "Tell her I love her," and heard, "I will, sweetheart," she had been standing in her kitchen covering for a daughter whose car was not in the driveway, and whose bed had not been slept in, and whose husband was home alone making dinner for a 5-year-old who kept asking when Mummy was coming back. Hey everyone, my name is James. I'm 37 years old, and until about 11 months ago, I would have described my life as genuinely good. Not perfect, not without its friction, but good in the way that matters. Stable, warm, inhabited by people I trusted, and a daughter I was proud of, and a marriage I believed in. I want you to understand that before I tell you what I found when I drove to my mother-in-law's house on a Saturday morning in October and rang the doorbell and waited and heard, from the other side of the door, the particular sound of a house that contains only one person when it should have contained two. This is the story of what happened next, and of what had been happening for much longer than I knew. Let me go back to February, because that's where the texture of things began to change. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the specific way that a room changes when a window has been left open somewhere. A slight difference in temperature, a quality of air that is subtly wrong, and the persistent sense that something is not where it should be. Claire and I had been married for 9 years. We had one daughter, Rosie, who was 5 and had recently decided that the primary organizing principle of her existence was horses. Horse drawings, horse books, horse stuffed animals arranged on her bed in what she described as a herd and managed with the territorial seriousness of a child who has found her people and is not taking questions. Claire was 34, warm and socially easy in the way of someone who had always found human connection straightforward, the kind of woman who remembered the names of your colleagues and your parents' anniversaries and the specific things you'd mentioned once that mattered to you. I had loved this about her for as long as I'd known her. Her mother was Patricia, Pat, to everyone who knew her, 63 years old, a retired schoolteacher who lived 40 minutes away in the town where Claire had grown up. Pat was the kind of mother-in-law that other people describe as lucky to have. Warm, unobtrusive, genuinely fond of me in a way that never felt performed. She called twice a week. She had Rosie for weekends occasionally when Claire and I needed time. She made a point of asking me about my life rather than simply routing all conversation through her daughter. I trusted her completely. In February, Claire began visiting her more often. The pattern established itself gradually, a Saturday here, an overnight there. Then by March, a regular rhythm of Friday evening departure and Sunday afternoon return that Claire explained as her mother recovering from a minor procedure on her knee. Nothing serious, she said. But Pat was finding the stairs difficult and appreciated the company and the help. It was the kind of explanation that required no investigation. Pat was 63. The knee procedure was mentioned in passing with the casual specificity of true information, and visiting a recovering parent is exactly the kind of thing a devoted daughter does. I thought nothing of it. I made dinners for Rosie on Friday evenings and answered the horse questions and read the horse books and told myself I was glad Claire was taking care of her mother. The first thing I noticed that didn't fit was small enough that I nearly dismissed it entirely. In early March, I called Pat's landline on a Saturday afternoon. Claire's mobile had gone to voicemail twice, and I was checking that they'd arrived safely, a habit from the years before I'd stopped thinking about it. Pat answered on the second ring, warm and easy as always, and we talked for 3 minutes about nothing particular. Rosie's horses, the weather, whether the knee was improving. At no point in the conversation did she mention Claire. Not once. Not a reference to what they'd been doing. Not, she's just in the other room. Not the casual background presence of a daughter in the same house. I noticed this in the way you notice a note that should be in a piece of music and isn't. Not consciously, but somewhere below the level of conscious attention, as a small wrongness in the texture of the thing. I mentioned to Claire that evening that I'd called her mother. She said yes, I know. She mentioned it. Easy. Unremarkable. The conversation of two people whose lives overlap completely. But I thought about the 3-minute conversation that had contained no Claire for the rest of that day, and I filed it in the back of my mind where I kept the things that didn't quite fit. Rosie provided the second signal, as she would continue to do throughout this story, not because she understood what she was transmitting, but because children observe without the social software that teaches adults to manage what they've seen. She came to me on a Sunday morning in late March with a drawing she'd made. "This is Granny Pat's house," she said, pointing to a rectangle with windows. "And this is Granny Pat." A figure in the doorway. I waited for the figure that would be Claire. Rosie pointed to a blank space beside the house. "Mummy was going somewhere," she said. "Granny Pat said she'd be back." I looked at the drawing. "When was this, sweetheart?" "Last time," she said, with the complete neutrality of a child reporting a fact. I helped her add a horse to the drawing and said nothing further. But I thought about Mummy was going somewhere for the rest of the week, and the filing cabinet in the back of my mind was beginning to fill. My closest friend since school was a man named Greg, steady, observant, the kind of friend who tells you the truth with enough care that you can actually hear it. He came over on a Friday evening in April, and we watched football and talked about the ordinary things of our lives. And at some point, with the specific directness that was simply his register, he said, "Is everything all right with you and Claire?" "Why do you ask?" He was quiet for a moment. "I ran into her last Saturday. In town." She seemed surprised to see me. Not in the normal way. In the way of someone who wasn't expecting to be seen. "She was in town last Saturday," I said. "Not at her mother's?" Another pause. "I assumed she'd come back early," he said. "Maybe I was wrong about the day." We let the conversation move forward. But Greg's pause, the specific pause of a man who was not wrong about the day and knew it and was deciding how much to say, lived in me for a week afterward. April ended and May began, and the Friday departures continued, and I was no longer accepting them without thinking. I was thinking. I just hadn't yet decided what to do about the thinking. James enters the story inside a marriage he has experienced as genuinely sound, not idealized, not naive, but the earned confidence of 9 years of shared life with a woman he had good reason to trust. The Betrayal's architecture is constructed around precisely this confidence. The knee procedure explanation is chosen because it is the kind of thing that doesn't require verification from a man who has no habit of verifying his wife's stated whereabouts. Pat's role is established here as the deception's structural support, the trusted third party whose presence in the explanation makes it airtight, because James would no more question Pat's involvement than he would question gravity. Rosie's drawing is the section's most emotionally precise detail. The blank space where Claire should be, rendered by a 5-year-old who has no investment in any particular interpretation, is the most accurate portrait of the situation that exists at this point in the story. Greg's pause, "I wasn't wrong about the day," is the section's final signal. The first external confirmation that the story Claire has been telling James does not match the observable world. May arrived with the particular warmth of a spring that has decided to become summer ahead of schedule, and I settled into a new relationship with the information I'd been accumulating. I was paying attention now, not investigatively, not yet, but with the heightened awareness of a man who has given his instincts formal permission to operate. I noticed things I might previously have absorbed without registering. I filed them with the methodical patience of someone building a picture whose final shape he isn't yet sure he wants to see. The phone had changed. Not dramatically. Claire had never been secretive about her phone in the obvious sense, had never left the room to take calls, or behaved with the theatrical privacy of someone clearly hiding something. What had changed was subtler. The phone now traveled with her in a way it hadn't before. Charged upstairs rather than in the kitchen. Carried to the bathroom. Set face down on the table at dinner in a way that looked natural until I understood it as a habit rather than a posture. Once, a Tuesday evening in May, she was in the living room and I came in from the kitchen. I saw the specific motion of a hand closing an application before the body had finished processing my arrival. She looked up and smiled and said something about a work email, and I nodded and said something back, and the moment dissolved into the evening. I replayed it for 3 days. The emotional texture of our time together had shifted in a way that was harder to articulate than the phone behavior, but more acutely felt. She was present. I want to be clear about that. She was not cold or distant or checking out in the obvious way of a marriage in open crisis. She was warm, attentive, engaged with Rosie in the fully present way of a mother who loves her child without reservation. But there was a quality of, I kept reaching for the right word and arriving at the same one, performance. Not cynical performance, not calculated. The performance of a person who is managing something privately and is working harder than usual to ensure the surface remains undisturbed. I noticed this and felt ashamed of noticing it, which was its own information. The shame of a man who doesn't want what he's noticing to mean what it might mean. The name Daniel appeared in May. Claire mentioned him over dinner. A colleague, she said, who had been promoted to lead a project she was involved with. She said it neutrally and in passing, and it would have registered as nothing if I had not been, by that point, in the habit of noting names said with careful casualness. I noted it and said nothing, and later, alone, tried to remember if she'd mentioned a Daniel before. I didn't think she had. I looked him up. Her company's website had staff profiles. Daniel Reeve, project manager, joined 2 years ago. Mid-30s, dark hair, the profile photograph of someone who was comfortable being photographed. I looked at it longer than I had any stated reason to and felt the specific discomfort of a man who has just confirmed that a face exists to go with a name he'd been treating as abstract. The weekend visits to Pat's continued. I started paying attention to the details of the departures and returns in a way I hadn't before. Claire left at the same time each Friday, 5 o'clock, after Rosie's after-school club, and returned Sunday afternoons at varying times. She always came home via the supermarket, which meant she arrived with shopping bags that naturalized the return and filled the first 20 minutes of her presence with the ordinary activity of putting things away. I had previously thought nothing of this. I now understood it as a transition ritual, the specific behavior of someone who needs a few minutes to shift back into one context from another. I called Pat on a Saturday in mid-May. Not to check. I was beyond the checking phase. I was in the observation phase. But to hear her voice and see how it sounded when Claire was not there. She answered warmly. We talked for 4 minutes. The conversation was entirely natural. Rosie's horses, the improvement in Pat's knee, a television program she'd been watching. At no point did Claire surface. Not a mention, not a background sound, not the ambient presence of a daughter somewhere in the same house. For minutes. No Claire. I ended the call and sat at the kitchen table and thought, she is not there. She has not been there. Pat is covering for her and has been covering for her for months, and whatever is happening on those weekends is happening somewhere else entirely. The certainty of this settled into me with the specific weight of a thing that has been true for a long time and has finally been acknowledged. I sat with it for the rest of the evening, through Rosie's bath and bedtime and the horse story she'd selected, and when the house was quiet, I went to the kitchen and stood at the window in the dark and thought, I need to know where she is. Greg called the following week. I told him more than I had in April. Not everything, but the shape of it, the Pat conversations without Claire, the phone behavior, Daniel's name. He listened with the specific stillness of a man who is not surprised and has decided to be honest about not being surprised. I've been thinking about what I saw in April, he said. She was with someone. I didn't see clearly enough to be certain, but she was with someone. Daniel Reeve, I said, the name out loud for the first time. I don't know, he said. I didn't see his face. But someone. Yes, he said. Someone. I thanked him and ended the call and made dinner and helped Rosie with a horse drawing and said nothing to anyone. And the picture I'd been assembling had acquired enough of its final shape that I could no longer pretend I didn't know what it was. James's behavior in May maps the precise psychology of a man who has moved from passive unease into structured observation while still withholding formal acknowledgement of what the observation is producing. Each signal, the traveling phone, the app closure, the performance quality of Claire's warmth, Daniel's name said with careful neutrality, is registered and filed rather than acted upon, because acting would require accepting a hypothesis that carries an enormous emotional cost. The shame he feels for noticing the performance quality of Claire's warmth is the section's most psychologically precise detail. The discomfort of accurate perception in a person who still loves what he is accurately perceiving. Pat's absence from 2 phone conversations, for minutes each, warm and natural and entirely Claire-free, is the section's structural turning point. It transforms the accumulation of softer signals into something concrete. Pat is not simply failing to mention Claire. She is, in her conversational ease, performing the presence of a daughter who is not there. Greg's confirmation, she was with someone, closes the section's arc. James is no longer alone with his observations. The external world has begun to confirm them. June, the longest days of the year, the light staying until 9 o'clock, the evenings with that particular quality of warmth that makes ordinary streets look more significant than they are. I made a decision in the first week of June that I've examined many times since and that I would make again. I decided to find out for certain before I said anything to anyone, including Claire. Not because I wanted to be wrong. I was past the phase of wanting to be wrong, had moved through it and arrived somewhere harder and clearer. But because confronting someone with suspicion rather than knowledge gives them too much room to manage the conversation. And I understood, by this point, that I was dealing with someone who had been managing conversations with considerable skill for several months. The first thing I did was drive to Pat's house. Not that Saturday, the following one, the first weekend of June, when Claire had left on Friday as usual. I drove there on Saturday morning, taking a route that let me approach from the side street where her car would have been visible from the road. I parked 100 meters back and sat and looked at the driveway. Pat's car. Only Pat's car. I drove to the front, parked, walked to the door, rang the bell. Pat answered. She was in her garden clothes. She'd been weeding, clearly, a trowel in one hand. And when she saw me, her expression moved through 3 things in rapid succession: surprise, then recognition, then a very brief and very controlled recalibration that I would not have caught if I hadn't been watching for exactly this. James, she said. What a lovely surprise. I was passing, I said. Is Claire around? The smallest pause. She's popped out to the shops, she said. She shouldn't be long. Come in. I'll put the kettle on. I went in. I sat in Pat's kitchen that I had sat in many times before and drank tea and talked about the weather and Rosie and the garden. And the conversation was entirely warm and entirely natural and entirely the performance of a woman who was very good at this and had been doing it for long enough to have ironed out the hesitations. I drove home and sat in the car in our driveway and thought. She covered without a moment's real hesitation. This is not the first time she has covered. She has been doing this for months, and she has practiced at it. And the ease of it is the most devastating thing I have observed so far. More devastating than the absent car, more devastating than the practiced lie, because it tells me that Pat made a choice, deliberate and sustained, to participate in something being done to me. I needed to know where Claire actually was on those weekends. And I was going to find out without asking anyone who would tell Claire I'd asked. I began with what I had access to. Our shared family calendar, which Claire managed and which I rarely looked at in detail because she had always been the organizer of our shared life. I looked at it now, carefully, going back to February. The entries for the Friday to Sunday weekends read simply, Mums. Every one of them. Nothing else. I looked at our shared credit card statements next, something I had legitimate access to and had simply not been reviewing with attention. What I found, no transactions on any of the relevant weekends that corresponded to Pat's area. No supermarket in Pat's town, no petrol station on the route. But on 4 of the 6 weekends I checked, there were transactions in a different part of the city, a part one associated with nothing in our lives, with no friend or family or obligation that I could identify. A wine bar, a restaurant, once a hotel. A hotel. I sat with the hotel charge for a long time. It was not in Pat's town. It was a 40-minute drive from our house in a direction that had nothing to do with where Claire said she was going. The red herring arrived in the second week of June, and it was convincing enough to cost me 10 days. Claire came home on a Sunday and, over dinner, mentioned that she'd been helping a colleague through a difficult period, a woman named Fiona, she said, who was going through a separation and had needed someone to be with her on some weekends. She'd been keeping it quiet, she said, because Fiona was intensely private and had asked her not to discuss it, but she felt I should know she'd been splitting some of her time between her mother's and Fiona's. The credit card charges were from Fiona's neighborhood. It was entirely plausible. The detail about Fiona's privacy explained why Claire hadn't mentioned it. The specific location of the charges fitted the explanation. I accepted it for 10 days with the relief of a man who has been holding his breath and found the air was still there. Then I looked Fiona up. Claire's company had a staff directory, not fully public, but accessible through a professional network she'd once shown me how to use. I found a Fiona on the list, a Fiona Marsh, same department as Claire. I found her on a professional network. Her relationship status had not changed. She was not going through a separation. Her most recent post, timestamped the previous weekend, showed her at a birthday party in a city 200 miles away. I sat with this for a long time. Not anger, not yet. Something colder than anger. The specific clarity of a man who has just confirmed that a false explanation was constructed specifically to answer the questions he'd been getting too close to asking. The Fiona explanation was not a coincidence of timing. It had been prepared. I thought about Pat in her garden clothes, trowel in hand, covering without hesitation. I thought about how long this had been running. I thought about Daniel Reeves' profile photograph. And I thought, I know enough to act. I just need one more thing. The following Friday, instead of staying home, I arranged for Rosie to go to my mother's for the weekend. Told her it was a special grandmother trip, which she accepted with horse-focused equanimity, and I followed Claire. I stayed 3 cars back. She drove for 35 minutes, not toward Pat's, not toward the area of the hotel charge, but to a neighborhood in the eastern part of the city that I knew by name, but had no personal connection to. She parked on a residential street. She took her bag from the boot with the ease of someone who had done this many times. She walked to the entrance of a flat conversion, a Victorian terrace divided into 4 units, and used a key to let herself in. A key, not a doorbell. A key. I sat outside for 2 hours. Then I drove home and thought about what a key means. Not a visit, not a hotel, not a temporary arrangement, but a key, the specific intimacy of someone who has been given access, who is expected, who belongs there in a way that has been formalized. I thought about this all weekend. By Monday morning, I knew what I was going to do. The investigation operates through a chain of decisions and their consequences that tightens with each link. James's decision to drive to Pat's house, the most direct possible test of the story he's been told, produces the most revealing possible result. Pat's performed ease, the practiced cover, the recalibration caught in her expression. This leads directly to the credit card review, which produces the hotel charge. The hotel charge leads to Claire's Fiona explanation, which leads to James's verification of Fiona's actual situation, which dismantles the explanation completely. Each false story requires a more elaborate truth to disprove it, and the elaborateness of the disproof is itself evidence of the elaborateness of the deception. The key is the section's most structurally significant discovery. It transforms the affair from something that happens in hotels and restaurants into something that has an address, a domestic space, a formalized intimacy. The difference between a hotel booking and a key is the difference between an encounter and an arrangement, and James understands this distinction immediately and completely. Pat's role deepens here from passive cover to active participation. Her kitchen conversation is not just protection of her daughter, but a performance delivered to a son-in-law she has decided to deceive, and the ease of it tells James everything he needs to know about how long this has been rehearsed. The week between following Claire to the flat and the confrontation was the most controlled week of my life. I want to be clear about why I waited a week rather than confronting her the moment she came home on Sunday. The reason was not that I needed more evidence. I had enough. The reason was not that I was uncertain. I was not uncertain. The reason was this. I had a 5-year-old daughter who was going to spend the rest of her childhood in whatever arrangement came after the confrontation, and I needed to enter that conversation from a position of clarity rather than raw shock. I needed to have thought about what I wanted from it. Not what I wanted to say, but what I wanted to happen afterward for Rosie. I called a lawyer on Monday. Her name was Helen Marsh, no relation to Daniel Reeve. A coincidence I noted without irony. And she was in her early 50s, precise and experienced in the way of someone who has had this specific conversation many times and has learned which questions to ask in which order. We met on Wednesday morning. I told her what I knew and how I knew it. She asked about assets, about the mortgage, about Rosie's school and current arrangements. She told me what the process would look like and what I should and should not say before the formal process began. I took notes. I spent Thursday evening doing something I had been avoiding. I went through the family photographs. Not to find evidence, I had evidence, but to establish, for myself, the full timeline of what had been happening alongside what I believed was happening. The summer barbecue in June of last year. All of us in the garden, Claire and Pat laughing at something Rosie had said. The Christmas photographs. Pat in our living room with a glass of wine. Warm and present, and already, I now understood, already inside the knowledge that she would carry for the next however many months. The birthday photographs from February, the month the Friday visits had begun, Pat and Claire side by side with a cake. The specific, easy warmth of two people who share a secret that binds them. I looked at these photographs for a long time. Not at Claire. I had processed Claire. At Pat. At the woman who had smiled at me in every photograph and called me sweetheart and told me I was the best thing that had ever happened to her daughter. I put the photographs away and made tea and sat in the kitchen for an hour. And the grief I felt for Pat's betrayal was different from the grief for Claire's. Quieter, more bewildered. The grief of a man who has lost something he hadn't known was possible to lose. Rosie came home from my mother's on Saturday morning. She arrived with a drawing she'd made for me. A horse, which was expected, but this one had a rider, which was new. "That's you," she said, pointing to the rider. "You're going on an adventure." I asked her where the adventure was going. She thought about it. "Somewhere new," she said, "with lots of horses." I hung the drawing on the refrigerator and thought, I am going somewhere new. I just need to get through the next 24 hours first. The confrontation happened on Sunday evening. Rosie was asleep. Claire had come home at 4, done the shopping bag transition, made dinner, been entirely warm and present through the evening. The version of herself she presented at home, which I now understood had been maintained in parallel with another version of herself somewhere else for months. After Rosie was in bed, she sat on the sofa with a book, and I came and sat across from her and put my phone on the table between us, the screen displaying a photograph. Not one of Paul's photographs. I hadn't hired an investigator. The photograph was one I had taken myself from my car on Friday evening. The Victorian Terrace, Claire's car in the street outside it, time-stamped. She looked at it. Her expression moved through several things. Recognition, the rapid calculation of available responses, and then a stillness that settled over her face like the specific calm of someone who has been anticipating this moment and has arrived at it. "James," she said. "I followed you on Friday," I said. "I want you to tell me whose flat that is." A long pause. "Daniel's," she said. "Daniel Reeve." "Yes." "How long?" She looked at the window. "Since January." January. The Friday visits to Pat's had started in February, which meant that the cover story had been constructed after the affair had already begun, built to contain something that already existed, not to enable something new. "Your mother," I said. Claire looked at her hands. "She found out in March." I told her. "You told her." "I needed someone to," she stopped. "I know how it sounds." "She covered for you," I said. "Every time I called. Every time I said tell her I love her. She covered for you for 3 months while I was here alone with Rosie." "I know. You know." The two words contained everything I felt, and I let them sit in the room. "I'm so sorry," she said. And she was. I could hear it. The genuine quality of it. The remorse that had been building behind the managed surface for months and was now, finally, fully in the room. But sorry, I had already understood, was not the same as finished. "How serious?" I said. A pause long enough to be its own answer. "Serious," she said. "I'm sorry. I know that's worse." "Does he have children?" "No." "Does he know about Rosie?" "Yes. He knows everything about my life." This was the sentence that reached the deepest. Not the affair, not the hotel, not the key, not Pat's participation, but he knows everything about my life. The intimacy of that. The specific violation of a man who exists in another part of the city knowing everything about my daughter while she knew nothing about him. "I want to try," Claire said. "I want to end it and try counseling and—" "I know you do," I said. "I need you to know that I can't answer that tonight. I need some time." She nodded. "And I need to talk to your mother," I said. "Not tonight. But I need to have that conversation." Claire said nothing, which was the right response to a statement that didn't require one. I went upstairs and sat in the dark in the spare room and listened to the house and thought about January. About 9 months of this. About every Friday departure and every Sunday return and every phone call to Pat and every time Pat had said "I will, sweetheart," when I asked her to pass along love I'd trusted her to deliver. 9 months. Long enough to become a different life. long enough that the ending of it would require the dismantling of more than one arrangement. The confrontation scene is structured around the revelation of Pat's role, and the emotional weight of this section falls there rather than on the affair itself, a deliberate and psychologically accurate choice. James has been processing the affair for weeks. What is new in this scene, what arrives with fresh force, is the confirmation that Pat made an active and sustained choice to participate. Claire's disclosure, "I told her in March I needed someone," reveals the specific dynamic. A daughter who needed an accomplice found one in her mother, who provided it out of loyalty to her child without, perhaps, fully calculating what she was doing to her son-in-law and granddaughter. The sentence, "He knows everything about my life," is the confrontation's most devastating detail, not because it reveals the depth of the affair, but because it reveals the specific asymmetry of the situation. Daniel Reeve has been fully informed about a family he has no right to know, while the family's actual member has been kept in managed ignorance. James's announcement that he needs to speak to Pat is the section's closing gesture. The affair and the cover-up are separate betrayals, and he intends to address them separately. This is not anger management, but moral clarity. "I called Pat on Monday morning from the car before the school run. I had thought about how to begin this conversation for 2 days and had arrived at the conclusion that there was no good way to begin it, and that the attempt to find one was itself a form of avoidance. So I called, and when she answered, I said, without preamble, 'I know, Pat. I know everything, and I need to see you today.'" A silence on her end. Not the surprised silence of someone receiving unexpected information, the particular silence of someone who has been waiting for a specific call and has now received it. "James," she said. Her voice had changed. Not the warm, easy Pat of 9 years of Sunday lunches and birthday dinners. Something smaller. Something that had been reduced. "Today," I said. "Please." "Yes," she said. "Come for lunch." I arranged for Rosie to go to my mother's after school. I drove to Pat's in the early afternoon, the 40-minute drive I had made dozens of times over 9 years, and everything about the route was familiar and nothing about the arrival felt like it usually did. I parked in the driveway. Claire's car was not there, which I had expected, but which still registered as something, and rang the doorbell and heard Pat's footsteps and watched the door open. She looked smaller than she usually did. I don't know how else to describe it. Not physically smaller. She was the same woman, the same height, the same gray-streaked hair she'd worn the same way for years. But there was something diminished in her bearing, a reduction that I recognized as the specific quality of someone who has been carrying a thing that has now been set down. "Come in," she said. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd given me tea a month earlier while lying about her daughter's whereabouts with practiced ease. She had made sandwiches. This struck me as deeply strange and entirely characteristic of a woman who responded to difficult situations by feeding people. "How long did you know?" I said. "March," she said. "Claire told me in March." 5 months. "Yes." "Pat." I stopped. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say and found, sitting across from her in the kitchen I'd sat in for 9 years, that the rehearsed version was insufficient. "I called you every weekend. Every time Claire was supposedly here. I said tell her I love her, and you said I will, sweetheart. You said that to me." She looked at the table. Her hands were folded in front of her, and she was looking at them in the way of someone examining evidence of themselves they would rather not see. "I know," she said. "I need to understand something," I said. "Not to hurt you. I genuinely need to understand. Did you think about what you were doing to Rosie? Because she was here sometimes. She was in this house asking where her mother was, and you were telling her. She was never here when—" Pat stopped. "The times Claire brought Rosie here were genuine. She would never have. She would never have brought Rosie here as cover." I said. "I believe that. But Rosie is 5 and she knows something is wrong, and she's been drawing pictures of her mother going somewhere and Granny Pat being alone in the doorway. And she did that because she was here once when Claire wasn't, and you told her Mummy would be back, and I need you to understand that a 5-year-old absorbed that." Pat's eyes were wet. Not the performed wet of someone managing a scene, the real kind. "I told Claire she had to tell you," she said. "Every time. Every weekend I covered for her. I told her she had to tell you. I said I couldn't keep doing it. But you kept doing it. She's my daughter," she said. Simply, without defense. As if this explained everything, which in some ways it did. "She's my wife," I said. "Rosie is my daughter." That should have mattered too. She didn't answer. Because there was no answer. She had made a choice between competing loyalties, and she had chosen the one she had known the longest, and the logic of it was entirely human and entirely devastating, and no amount of lunch sandwiches was going to resolve the gap between what I had believed her to be and what she had turned out to be when the choice was required. We sat in the kitchen for another hour. She apologized several times in the specific way of someone who understands that the apology is insufficient and is offering it anyway, because it is the only thing available. I listened to the apologies and accepted them without pretending they changed anything, because they didn't change anything, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. Before I left, she said, "Are you going to divorce her?" "I don't know yet," I said. "She loves you," Pat said. "Whatever it looks like, she loves you." I looked at her, at the woman who had called me sweetheart for 9 years and had known for 5 months and had chosen not to tell me. "I know she does," I said. "That's not the part I'm uncertain about." I drove home in the early evening, the road familiar and strange in equal measure, and I thought about the specific topology of what had been done to me. Not a single betrayal, but two, layered, the outer one enabling the inner one, each incomprehensible on its own terms, and together forming something I was going to spend a long time processing. I picked Rosie up from my mother's. She had made a new drawing on the drive over, which she presented to me in the car, a horse, a rider, and a house. "That's our new house," she said, pointing to the house. "It's got a stable." I asked her where the old house had gone. She thought about it. "It's still there," she said. "Just the horse lives here now." I drove home thinking about stables and about the specific wisdom of 5-year-olds who absorb change before the adults around them have figured out how to name it. And I thought, she's going to be okay. She's processing it in horses. She's going to be fine. I was less certain about myself, but I thought I'd get there. Pat's section is the story's moral center, and it is handled with the complexity the situation requires. She is not a villain. She is a mother who made a sustained choice in favor of protecting her child at the cost of her son-in-law's reality, and the human logic of this choice, "She's my daughter," said without defense, is entirely understandable and entirely insufficient. Her repeated private pressure on Claire to tell James, every time I covered for her, "I told her she had to tell you," reveals the self-deception embedded in her participation. She told herself that covering was temporary, that Claire would soon resolve the situation, and this narrative allowed her to continue doing something she understood was wrong. The mistake, and the lesson embedded in it, is this: loyalty to someone you love does not license participation in the harm they are causing to someone else. Pat knew this. Her wet eyes, the reduced quality of her bearing, are evidence that she knew, and chose the easier path anyway. James's observation about Rosie, the 5-year-old who drew her mother going somewhere and Granny Pat alone in the doorway, is the conversation's most devastating moment. It makes concrete the cost to the most innocent party of two adults' mutual agreement to manage the truth. Rosie's drawing of the new house with the stable is the section's closing grace note, the child processing change through the thing she loves most, ahead of the adults who are still figuring out what to do. It's been 8 months since the Sunday evening when I put my phone on the coffee table and Claire looked at the photograph of her car outside Daniel Reeves' flat. I want to tell you where things are with the honesty the story deserves, rather than the tidiness it might prefer. The divorce was filed in October. Helen Marsh managed the process with the quiet competence I had come to rely on, and the outcome was what I had built it around. Rosie, primarily. Equal time, consistent schedule, 2 addresses that are warm and stable and reliable and located, deliberately, within 10 minutes of each other so that her world doesn't require reorganization, only expansion. She has horse drawings at both addresses. She has a stuffed horse collection that she manages with the serious diplomatic equity of a child who has decided that both homes are real and both deserve full representation. She is, as best I can determine, going to be okay, genuinely okay. Not performed okay, the okay of a child who has processed a change and found that the love she needs is still present on both sides of it. I moved into a flat in September. I furnished it slowly and deliberately, choosing things because I wanted them rather than because they filled a space. There is a kitchen that gets the morning light at an angle I've started to depend on. There is a bookshelf that holds the books I've actually been meaning to read. There is a wall in Rosie's room where she has established a gallery of horse drawings that constitutes, in her assessment, the finest collection currently in existence. I agree with her assessment. Greg has been constant throughout in the way of the oldest friendships, present when I needed company, absent when I needed space, never requiring me to be further along in my processing than I actually was. He came over in November with beer and the specific companionship of a man who tells you the truth even when you haven't asked, and we sat in the new kitchen and talked about everything and nothing, and I found, for the first time in months, that I could be in a room without the background hum of what I'd been carrying. The Pat situation has been the most complicated part of the aftermath, and I want to be honest about that because I think it's the part people in similar situations find least discussed. I did not cut Pat off. I thought about it. I held the option carefully and examined it from every angle and put it down. The reason was Rosie. Pat is Rosie's grandmother, and Rosie loves her, and whatever Pat did to me, she did not do to Rosie, and removing Pat from Rosie's life because of what she did to mine would be a form of punishment applied to the wrong person. So Pat sees Rosie. Pat calls Rosie. Pat sends Rosie horse books, which Rosie receives with the specific reverence of someone being given exactly the right thing. Pat and I have seen each other 4 times since October. The relationship between us is not what it was. It cannot be what it was, and pretending otherwise would be its own dishonesty. But it is not nothing either. It is something in the process of becoming whatever it is going to be, and I have decided to let it become that gradually rather than forcing a resolution that isn't ready to exist. She called me in November. Not about logistics, not about Rosie's schedule. She called to say something she'd apparently been building towards since October. She said, "I want you to know that what I did was wrong. Not just that I'm sorry, that it was wrong. That I understood it was wrong and I did it anyway, and I have been living with that." I said, "I know, Pat." She said, "I don't think you should forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I know." I said, "I'll think about the forgiving. I'll let you know how I get on." There was a silence on her end that contained something that might have been the beginning of something. Not resolution, not repair, but the first small step toward whatever is possible after the kind of honesty she had just offered. I've been walking in the mornings. Not running. Walking, which is different, which requires less of you physically and more of you mentally, which suits the stage of recovery I'm in. 40 minutes at 7 o'clock, the city waking up around me, the specific quality of early morning light that makes familiar streets look like they're being seen for the first time. I found this valuable beyond what I expected. The physical rhythm of it, the forward motion, the evidence that you can cover ground simply by putting one foot in front of the other. I met someone in December, not a relationship. I want to be clear about what this is and what it isn't. Her name is Anna, and she's a landscape architect who was at a dinner party Greg hosted with the specific social engineering of a man who has decided his friend has been alone long enough. We talked for 2 hours about cities and green space and the question of whether the places we build reflect or shape the people who live in them. She had views on this that I found more interesting than my own. We've had coffee twice. We text occasionally. Nothing certain, but something real, the genuine interest of 2 people finding each other interesting. And after the months I had been through, I found the realness of it, its uncomplicated quality, a relief. What I carry out of the last year, offered honestly. I've learned that trust extended to someone you love extends, by implication, to the people that person trusts, and that this extension is invisible until it isn't. I trusted Pat because I trusted Claire, and Claire trusted Pat to cover for her, and the chain of trust created a structure within which I was the only person without access to the truth of my own life. This is the specific vulnerability of trusting well, that the people inside your trust can use it in ways you cannot anticipate. I've learned that the cover-up and the original act are separate moral events. What Claire did was one thing. What Pat did was another. Each requires its own processing, its own accounting, its own eventual arrival at whatever forgiveness looks like for each. I am at different stages with each. I am further along with Claire than I expected to be, and less far along with Pat than I expected to be, and I've decided to let this asymmetry exist rather than forcing either toward a pace that isn't honest. And I've learned, this is the thing I hold most carefully, that the life a crisis builds, on the other side of the crisis itself, is not a diminished version of the life before it. It is different. It is, in some ways, more deliberately inhabited. The morning walks, the new flat chosen with actual attention, the horse gallery in Rosie's room, Anna's more interesting views on green space. These are not consolations. They are the materials of a life being lived with the full quality of attention it deserves. Research indicates that in a significant proportion of discovered affairs, a close family member of the unfaithful partner was aware of the situation, asked to provide cover, told in confidence, used as an alibi. 1 in 4 discovered affairs involves this kind of familial participation. I was one of them, and what I want to offer to anyone in a similar situation is this. The betrayal of a person who covered for the betrayal is not a lesser betrayal. It is a different one. It requires its own naming and its own processing and its own eventual reckoning. And rushing any of those stages in the direction of resolution before they're ready is its own form of dishonesty. I am not rushed. I am walking forward 40 minutes at a time in the morning light. Rosie informed me last week that she wants a real horse. I told her we'd have to think about where we'd put it. She said the flat has a courtyard. I said a courtyard was not a stable. She looked at me with the specific patience of a child waiting for an adult to catch up with an obvious solution. We'll get a small horse, she said. I told her I'd look into it. I probably won't look into it. But I thought about it all day, and thinking about small horses in courtyards is, I've discovered, one of the better things to think about when you're rebuilding a life from its foundations. You take the good material wherever you find it. The James bears careful comparison with the James of the opening. The man who made 2 cups of coffee without thinking about it, who trusted Pat as a condition of his daily life rather than as a conscious choice, who believed that the warmth of an established family was evidence of its soundness. The man making morning walks in the early light of a new flat is not a lesser version of that man. He is a more deliberately inhabited version of him. Someone who has learned the distinction between trust as automatic condition and trust as conscious practice. The Pat relationship is the section's most psychologically sophisticated element. James's decision not to cut her off is made specifically for Rosie and not for himself. A form of parental maturity that prioritizes the child's relationship over the adult's grievance. Pat's November call, "I don't think you should forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I know," is one of the story's most honest moments. The acknowledgement of wrongness without the demand for absolution, which is a more honest position than most people in Pat's situation manage. Rosie's request for a small horse in the courtyard is the section's closing grace note. The child who has been the story's most accurate observer throughout now offering, entirely unconsciously, the story's best image of adaptive resilience, finding the solution within the available space and calling it sufficient. James's story maps a particular and underexamined configuration of betrayal, not simply a wife's affair, but the construction of a cover architecture that required the active participation of a trusted third party. The affair and the cover-up are distinct moral events that the story treats with appropriate distinctness, different in nature, different in the kind of damage they cause, requiring different processes of reckoning. Claire's affair follows a recognizable human pattern, a marriage that had grown comfortable enough to mistake familiarity for genuine closeness, a gap that opened gradually between the surface of a functioning partnership and the emotional needs of one of its members, and a choice, the wrong choice, in terms of both ethics and consequence, to address that gap through concealment rather than conversation. None of this is unusual. What is unusual is the cover architecture. Pat is the story's most complex character, and the story's most important lesson is contained in her. She made a choice, sustained, repeated, active, to participate in the deception of a man she called family, out of loyalty to a daughter she loved. The human logic of this choice is entirely understandable. Its moral inadequacy is equally clear. The specific damage of Pat's participation is not the same as the damage of the affair. It is the damage of the trusted witness who chooses silence, of the person inside the family's emotional infrastructure who uses that position to protect one member at the cost of another. James's processing of Pat's betrayal separately from Claire's, acknowledging that he is at different stages with each, is the story's most psychologically mature element. Rosie, throughout the story, functions as its most accurate observer, the child whose drawings of Granny Pat alone in the doorway, of Mummy going somewhere, of the new house with the stable, map the story's emotional geography more precisely than any adult account. She is the constant in the equation, the thing both parents hold as certain when everything else has become uncertain, The person whose stability, both the divorce's management and the decision to maintain Pat's access, are ultimately designed to protect. What James builds after the morning walks, the horse gallery, and his more interesting views on urban green space represents not recovery from a crisis, but recovery into a more deliberately inhabited life. The morning light on familiar streets seen as if for the first time. The trust extended consciously rather than automatically. The small horse in the courtyard, proposed with the calm confidence of someone who considers the available space and finds a solution within it. This is, finally, what resilience looks like when it is not performed, not the declaration of having moved on, but the daily practice of moving forward, one deliberate step at a time, in whatever light is available.